War Thunder's newest jet bomber is the F-105 Thunderchief in the American tech tree. Let's check this big thing out. Originally, the F-105 was intended as a high-speed reconnaissance plane to replace multiple subsonic recon aircraft then in service with the U.S. military. However, it quickly became clear that a low-altitude supersonic bomber was a more pressing need, and the F-105 design was reworked to carry a single tactical nuclear weapon in an internal bomb bay. This also helped secure vital funding for the project. The design went through some major changes, as most did in those days, and the fuselage was redesigned to use the newly discovered area rule to reduce transonic drag. This is what gives the aircraft that distinctive Coke bottle fuselage shape you might have noticed. Believe it or not, the development was actually cancelled in 1953, but then seemingly out of nowhere the Air Force ordered prototypes the next year. Their performance showed good potential. It had great speed and acceptable range at low altitude, which were the two primary attributes needed at the time. Eventually, the Thunderchief entered service in 1958 with the U.S. Air Force. The D model that we have in War Thunder came a year later. The F-105 soon found itself as the primary American attack aircraft used during the Vietnam War, flying more missions than any other plane in that conflict, and also suffering more losses than any other plane. The F-105 was tragically misused in Vietnam, with munition shortages, restrictive mission taskings, and an ever-expanding network of surface-to-air missile launchers, combining to cause serious attrition. Pilots were required to fly a 100-mission tour of duty before rotating out, usually flying against the most heavily defended targets possible, and morale was often very low. Things got worse for the Thunderchief when the MiG-21 appeared, as the F-105 wasn't really well suited for air combat. Overall, about 380 Thunderchiefs were lost in Vietnam, most of them in combat. This represented almost half of all the F-105s ever built, earning the plane the nickname the Thud, and the inglorious distinction of being the only U.S. aircraft withdrawn from service due to operational combat losses. In War Thunder, the F-105 is at BR 9.7 and currently sits at the end of the bomber column. It carries the AN/ASG-19 radar set. Now, this is an odd one, but keep in mind that it was primarily a navigation radar, not a combat radar. It has a fixed search mode with no range or angle options, but it can lock targets for tracking. Kind of. If you lock a target, you get the radar gun sight rangefinder on them instead of a normal lock indication. Honestly, it's really most useful just as a search radar. Now, the weapon loads are where the 105 really shines. This thing carries a loadout for almost every occasion, with bombs, rockets, missiles, and chaff pods. My preferred loadout is the 14 750-pound bombs and 4 sidewinders. This gives enough ordnance to take out 2 strategic bases on some maps, or at least 1 plus a bunch of ground targets. The loadout of 3 3,000-pound bombs is also pretty strong. I mean, obviously. And if you manage to dump one of those 3,000-pounders into a cluster, camping on an objective point during a close air support mission, well, it's going to be a bad day for the other team. For air-to-air missiles, the Thud can take the AIM-9B, which is the familiar entry-level caged seeker IR missile you've probably used by now, and can upgrade to the AIM-9E. I've said a few times that I'm not a fan of the AIM-9E for a variety of reasons, but it's here. The secret to using these is not to launch any shots that you don't think an AIM-9B could hit. These missiles don't turn well and don't track well. For air-to-ground missiles, you get the AGM-12B bullpup. This is the same manually guided missile you may have used in other planes, and you can upgrade it to the AGM-12C. This is a monster. The AGM-12C is an updated version of the bullpup. It's still manually guided, but it has much longer range and more than twice the explosive mass over the 12B. if you routinely use the 105 for close air support, you're going to want the 12C as soon as you can get it. The flight performance of the F-105 is, well, wrong. Gaijin really screwed this one up. In real life, the F-105 was widely known to be fast, but unable to dogfight effectively. Aviation historian and author Greg Gobel once described the Thunderchief as being, quote, about as agile as a brick, unquote. And there are a generous quantity of pilot interviews in magazines and documentaries discussing how the F-105 simply wasn't a very maneuverable aircraft. I mean, it wasn't intended to be. They built this thing as a high-speed bomber, carrying a tactical nuclear warhead. The narrow wings just weren't intended for air combat. However, in War Thunder, this thing is at least as maneuverable as other dogfighters around its BR, and without bombs or even with a small weapon load, you can fly circles around some other planes. I'm not entirely sure if this was a simple error from the developers or if they were using some bad source material for creating the flight envelope in the game. I don't know, but I expect it'll get corrected eventually. There are already people complaining about this on the forums. As it stands, the F-105 has strong engine performance, which it should have, along with good acceleration, rate of climb, and respectable top-end speed. You can just barely push through Mach 1 even with a full weapon load at low altitude. Nice. You can also swing this thing around like a dogfighter, for now anyway, and I was able to have some success flying this out with only the Sidewinders and using it as an interceptor to attack enemy strike jets. Anyway, one notable caveat. The 105 can take chaff pods. Just chaff, no flares. But they go on the outboard wing pylons, so if you take them, you can't take the Sidewinders. It's odd to see countermeasure pods without flares, but that's actually not a technical error. The primary threat to the F-105 over Vietnam was radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, and the anti-radar countermeasures, such as the chaff pods here, were far more useful to protect against the SA-2 Godline missile installations than flares would have been. Flying the Thunderchief out in missions might seem like just another strike fighter, bombing a base and flying home. But it can be a bit more dynamic than that. This plane carries a heavier weapon load than some World War II bombers, and you can use it in a number of ways. You can carry enough bombs to destroy 2 strategic bases in one pass if you're careful, or you can take out one and then hit regular ground targets. You can also ignore the bases completely and just mop up some impressive kill totals against regular ground units. The air-to-ground missiles and rocket pods aren't especially useful in air battles, but you can still practice with them. Flying the F-105 out for close air support is gonna be pretty popular. With the quantity and quality of ordnance this thing carries, and its ability to take chaff pods, the Thunderchief gives you a lot of options in ground battles. The new bullpups have some great long-range punch, and you can carry enough ordnance to just carpet bomb huge chunks of the map in one pass. It'll be really interesting to watch how this fits into the ground battles meta long-term, but I suspect it's going to be quite popular. Also, as of right now, you absolutely can fly this plane out as a pure fighter. You can take the loadout of 4 AIM-9E missiles and hunt enemy ground pounders early game, using your air spawn to great effect. Su-7s are particularly ripe targets for interception, as they're fast enough to get to your bases quickly ahead of their team, allowing you to use your own good speed to intercept them without being vulnerable to faster enemy fighters that might be carrying good missiles. Another noteworthy tidbit: if you leave the Sidewinders at home and take the chaff pods, you can actually have a small margin of safety from long-range SAR-H shots if you decide to do high-altitude stuff with the 105. Play to your strengths. Visually, I have to confess that I'm not a big fan of the Thunderchief. Its vertical stabilizer looks really odd being so far forward. The wings are a weird shape, and it has a few aerodynamic oddities that really don't appeal to me. Some folks will like it, and that's okay. It's just not a plane that I particularly like looking at. The skins you get are pretty nice, but there are only 2 of them. When landing the F-105, try to remember that despite its name and appearance, this is a bomber, and it's huge. You'll want to practice a bit, but I find that landing fast gives a better margin of safety against approach stalls in a heavier plane like this. You get a drag chute, and the brakes are solid. Just try to touch down at least before the midfield point, and you'll be fine. Now, the cockpit of the F-105 is surprisingly good. They did a great job on modeling the interior, and the instrument panel is extremely accurate. You get a radar scope mounted a little lower than I like, but the radar warning receiver is right in my favorite location, and at this BR, it's more useful anyway. This plane was great to fly in VR, and I have no complaints. To close out the F-105D Thunderchief, this plane carries a completely absurd amount of ordnance and has weapon presets for just about every playstyle. The new AGM-12C missiles are a great addition to the close air support meta. It has chaff pods, and it can take a surprising amount of damage before going down. Lastly, as of right now, it's a very agile plane. However, you don't get flares with the chaff. The air-to-air missiles aren't great, and the radar set is pretty weak. The final verdict on the F-105D is that this plane has the potential to completely upend the close air support meta around its BR, and I think it's going to breathe new life into bomber gameplay and air battles. This is a very welcomed addition to the game, and I suspect it's going to be a favorite among a lot of players. As always, thanks for watching. Now, go fly your 100.
100 missions to be flown. Attention to the designated grid zone. 100 targets still unknown. But it's my belief that my Thunderchief strikes a telling blow to help G.I. Joe. Till 100 missions I myself have flown. 100 missions to be flown. It's good to know you're not alone. If a shrapnel stump means I have to jump, then the Jolly Green will pick me up clean. Till 100 missions I myself have flown. 100 missions to be flown. 100 bridges to be blown. On my left and right, the rest of my flight help keep me alive in my 105. Till 100 missions I myself have flown.